In the quiet town of Gold Creek, tucked away in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, a quiet bartender named Jed has spent years keeping his head low and his mind to himself. But when a gang of rowdy outlaws stumbles into his saloon one fateful evening, they push him too far. Little do they know, the quiet man they mock is not just a bartender, but a man with a past and a lightning-fast draw that will soon make them regret their reckless behavior. This is the tale of how a quiet soul becomes the deadliest man in the West. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. It was just another night in Gold Creek, a small town nestled in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The saloon, named the Rusty Spur, stood as the heart of the town. A place where men came to drink away their troubles, play cards, and gamble for what little they had. The clink of poker chips and the shuffle of cards had filled the air for years, but tonight, a different sound would echo through the saloon's wooden walls. Jed Calloway, the bartender, wiped down the counter with a rag, his movements steady and mechanical. He'd been working the bar here for a long time, long enough to know the faces of the regulars and to memorize the exact combination of whiskey and water each one preferred. A man of few words, Jed had a quiet demeanor, keeping to himself more often than not. But those who knew him, if they knew him at all, understood there was more to him than met the eye. The door swung open, and a gust of wind blew in, carrying the scent of pine and dust. The usual chatter faded as the new arrivals made their way to the bar, a gang of rough riders with eyes full of trouble and hearts full of arrogance. There were 5 of them, each dressed in worn leather coats, hats pulled low over their eyes, and boots that had seen more dust than the average man could ever dream of walking through. They walked with the kind of swagger that only comes from years of getting away with whatever they pleased, and tonight, they were looking for trouble. Jed didn't flinch as they approached. He wasn't new to trouble, though he preferred to avoid it if he could. But as the outlaws took their seats, the air grew thick with tension, and Jed could feel something was different about this crew. They weren't here for a quiet drink, they were here for a show. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his face, looked Jed over with a sneer. "You the bartender?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Jed didn't answer immediately, just gave the man a slow nod, letting the moment stretch between them. "Didn't know this place had a bartender with a face like that," the man continued, a smirk creeping across his lips. "Thought we were supposed to have someone more friendly behind the counter." The other men chuckled. Jed's eyes never left the man as he continued polishing the counter, unfazed. He didn't have time for their games, and in truth, he wasn't interested in their opinions of him. "Whiskey," the man ordered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "And make it quick." Jed moved without a word, reaching for the bottle behind the counter. As he poured the drink, the men continued to laugh and joke among themselves, completely oblivious to the stillness in the air. The saloon wasn't empty, but the other patrons had wisely backed away from the troublemakers. Gold Creek wasn't a place for men to start fights, but outlaws like these often forgot that. Jed slid the drink across the bar with a soft clink of glass. The scarred man grabbed the whiskey without a second thought, downing it in one go. He slammed the glass back onto the counter with enough force to make the other patrons glance nervously toward the door. "You look like the type who knows his whiskey, but what about your guns?" The man's voice was low, and for the first time, there was a challenge in it. "I bet a quiet guy like you doesn't even know how to use one." Jed's hand froze mid-motion as he reached for another bottle. He knew what was coming, had been expecting it, in fact. The outlaws were testing him, trying to see how far they could push before he broke. Jed didn't rise to the bait. His eyes stayed fixed on the scarred man as he grabbed a clean glass and began pouring the next drink. He didn't need to answer, not yet. It wasn't about words, it was about actions. And Jed's actions spoke volumes. "Didn't think so." The scarred man laughed, nudging his companions. "What's a quiet bartender like you doing in a place like this? You sure don't look like you belong in a town full of men like us." Jed's fingers tightened around the glass he was holding. He could feel his muscles stiffen, but he didn't let it show. The outlaws were pushing him, poking and prodding, trying to provoke a reaction. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "You should be careful," Jed said, his voice calm and measured. "You don't know who you're messing with." The scarred man leaned forward, his lips curling into a grin that was anything but friendly. "I think I know exactly who you are, Bartender," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're nothing. Just some coward hiding behind a bar, hoping no one notices you. And the only thing you're good at is pouring drinks." For a moment, the saloon was still, save for the soft hum of the fire crackling in the stove. Jed met the man's gaze, his heart steady and his mind calm. He was no coward. He'd never been one. But there were some battles that didn't need to be fought with words. Not yet. The outlaws continued their jeers, unaware that they were poking at a man who had once been faster than any of them could ever hope to be. The laughter from the outlaws rang out, harsh and grating against the quiet tension that had settled into the room. Jed's hand remained steady, though inside, something was starting to shift. His eyes never left the scarred man, though his mind wandered back to a time when he had lived for moments like this, when his hands had flown faster than the wind, and every day had been a challenge of survival. But that was a long time ago. Jed had traded the wild days of lawlessness for the quiet life of a bartender, and for the most part, it had suited him. Gold Creek was a simple town, untouched by the greater turmoil of the West, a place where men could escape their pasts. For years, Jed had kept his head down, pouring drinks, tending the fire, and watching the occasional brawl from the safety of the counter. But this felt different. The outlaws were here for something more than just a drink. They were looking to break him, to push him past his breaking point. Jed's mind briefly flickered to his old life. It had been a time of running, fighting, and drawing faster than a man could blink. It had been the life of an outlaw himself, before he'd left it all behind. He'd seen too much violence, too many good men lost, and he'd vowed never to draw again, to never let the violence consume him. But now, here they were, daring him, testing him. The scarred man leaned closer, his breath carrying the sour tang of whiskey. "What do you think you're going to do, bartender? You gonna shoot us all down, like some sort of hero?" He scoffed, the mockery in his voice growing thicker with each word. "You've got a funny idea of yourself, don't you?" Jed's fingers tightened around the glass he was polishing, his thumb brushing the rim. Every muscle in his body was tight, but his expression remained unchanged. The gang could see the calm in his eyes, and it only seemed to enrage them further. One of the men, shorter, with a scruffy beard and a bloodshot eye, snickered and stood up, slamming his hands onto the bar. "Guess what? We don't take kindly to people who think they're better than us," the man said, his voice rising. "You might be quiet, but I don't think you're so tough. No one comes to a place like Gold Creek and gets away with acting like they're better than us." The other outlaws nodded in agreement, and for a moment, Jed felt the weight of their collective gaze. They were testing him, not just as a man, but as a symbol of all the things they despised. The law, order, quietude, the things they'd long since abandoned in favor of chaos. Jed remained silent. The moment stretched, hanging in the air like a thick fog, as the gang waited for him to respond. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, their nervous glances fleeting as they watched the brewing storm. But Jed didn't falter. He lived through worse. His hand slid to the bottle behind the bar, the cool glass smooth beneath his fingers. He moved with deliberate slowness, uncorking the bottle of whiskey and pouring it carefully into a glass. Each movement seemed to stretch time, his every action unfolding in a rhythm that only he understood. He wasn't afraid. The scarred man reached for his gun. It was the slightest movement, barely noticeable. A twitch of his fingers, the subtle shift of his weight as he prepared to draw. Jed saw it instantly. Years of training had sharpened his senses to the point where every microsecond was etched into his memory. There it was, the moment of choice. The man was going to draw on him. He had made up his mind. But Jed wasn't worried. Not in the least. The moment had come, and Jed could feel the familiar tension in the air. The pulse of the crowd, the muffled thud of his heartbeat. The outlaw's hand slid toward the grip of his revolver, slow at first, but Jed's eyes never left his face. And in that moment, something shifted deep inside him. His old instincts, once buried beneath years of self-imposed restraint, surged to life. His body was already preparing, his legs bracing, his fingers itching at the memory of the draw. The thoughts flowed freely, his mind as clear as the sky after a storm. He had trained for this moment. He had lived for it. And yet, Jed wasn't eager. He wasn't excited by the prospect of a fight. There was no rush. He knew exactly what he had to do. It was just a matter of when. The scarred man's fingers were nearly touching the gun's grip when Jed moved. It wasn't fast, at least not at first. To an untrained eye, it might have seemed like an almost languid motion, a man casually rising from behind a bar. But Jed's hand shot out, faster than a rattlesnake strike. His fingers a blur as they grabbed the long-barreled pistol that had rested beneath the counter for years. The gun was out of the holster in an instant, his thumb flicking off the safety with a smooth motion that made the action seem almost effortless. The gang froze. Time seemed to slow, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. In one fluid motion, Jed leveled the gun at the scarred man's chest. His aim was perfect, steady, no hesitation. There was no need for theatrics or bravado. This was a quiet man's way of handling business. "You were right about one thing," Jed said, his voice low and deadly calm. "I'm not like the rest of you, but I'll be damned if I let you run this town into the dirt." The scarred man's hand hovered over the grip of his revolver, his eyes wide with realization. The room felt smaller now, the space between life and death narrowing with every breath. The other outlaws stood frozen, some with their hands instinctively reaching for their guns, others caught in the grip of terror. Jed's fingers twitched. The saloon held its breath. The scarred man's fingers, inches away from his gun's grip, stilled as if frozen in time. His face, once cocky and full of bravado, had drained of color. For the first time in a long time, he felt fear. It wasn't the kind of fear one would expect from a man who had lived by the barrel of a gun. No, it was a deeper, primal fear, the kind that came from realizing that your time might be up. Jed's gun was steady in his hand, the cold steel glinting in the dim light of the saloon. The barrel pointed straight at the man's chest, but Jed didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended. The low murmurs of the other patrons had fallen completely silent. There was no shuffle of cards, no scrape of chair legs on the wooden floor, just the crackling of the fire and the sound of Jed's breathing. It was the kind of stillness that you could almost feel, a tangible presence in the air, thick and heavy. The scarred man swallowed hard. His lips parted, as if he were going to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His gaze flicked to his men, who stood motionless, waiting for some sign from him. His eyes darted back to Jed, searching for any weakness, any hesitation. But Jed remained unmoving, his face calm, his hand steady. "You don't know who you're dealing with," the scarred man said finally, his voice shaky but trying to mask the fear with a touch of bravado. Jed didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The scarred man's words hung in the air, empty and pointless. The truth was, the man didn't know who he was dealing with, and neither did any of his companions. Jed wasn't just a bartender. He wasn't some lowly man hiding behind a counter, afraid of the rough riders who sauntered in and out of Gold Creek. Jed had a past that none of these men could ever hope to understand. He had been the fastest gun in the West, feared by outlaws and respected by lawmen alike. He'd earned his reputation in ways that most men could only dream of. But that had been years ago, a time when he'd been a different man, running from his own demons. He had chosen to leave that life behind, to seek peace in the quiet corners of the world, away from the violence. But the world had a way of finding him, and when it did, it brought with it the same kind of men who had once made him the most dangerous person anyone had ever met. Jed's fingers tightened around the revolver's grip, but he didn't raise the gun any higher. He knew what would happen if he did. He knew what kind of man the scarred man was. Someone who would draw first, without hesitation, and kill without remorse. But Jed wasn't worried. He wasn't worried about anything anymore. This was a test, and he wasn't about to fail. The man's eyes darted once again to his companions, then to the other patrons in the saloon, who were all watching the scene unfold. Some had even stepped back toward the corners, unsure of how things would go. Jed didn't take his eyes off the scarred man, his gaze as cold as the steel in his hand. The scarred man's hand twitched toward his gun again, but this time, Jed was ready. His eyes locked onto the movement, his focus absolute. The gunman wasn't fast enough. He would never be fast enough. Jed's thoughts were already moving, calculating the trajectory, the timing, the distance between them. Before the scarred man could even complete the motion, Jed's thumb was already flicking the hammer of his revolver back. His fingers moved in a blur, his body acting on instinct, just like it had done so many times before. The revolver roared to life with a deafening crack that shattered the silence of the saloon. Time seemed to slow. The scarred man's eyes widened in shock as his hand fell away from the gun, his body jerking backward. His chest, once full of bravado, now bore a new truth. Blood began to stain the front of his shirt, a deep red bloom that spread across the fabric, dripping onto the floor. The gunshot echoed, and for a split second, no one moved. No one spoke. The other outlaws stood frozen, caught in the whirlwind of disbelief. But the scarred man's body had already begun to slump to the floor, his life spilling out with him. Jed's gun remained steady, the smoke from the barrel curling into the air like a snake. His hand was still, but his mind was alive, sharp and focused. He didn't feel the rush of adrenaline, nor the satisfaction of taking down his target. There was only a quiet finality to the moment, as if everything had been leading to this point. The saloon was deathly silent. The other outlaws slowly began to reach for their guns, their hands shaking. But they knew better than to challenge Jed now. They could feel the weight of his gaze, the power of his presence, and they hesitated. No one had expected the quiet bartender to be this fast, this deadly. The scarred man had been the leader. He had been the one to push, to provoke, and now, he was nothing more than a stain on the floor. Jed didn't lower his gun. He wasn't done. Not yet. "I told you," he said softly, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a knife. "You don't know who you're messing with." The other outlaws, their guns still hovering near their sides, exchanged uncertain glances. They could see it now, the same thing the scarred man had failed to see. The man they'd mocked, the man they'd underestimated, wasn't just some bartender. He was a man who had seen more than they could imagine, and he wasn't afraid to prove it. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one of the outlaws, a younger man with a scruffy beard, took a step back. His eyes flicked nervously between his companions and the cold, steady gun in Jed's hand. "Maybe we should get out of here," he muttered, his voice shaky. The others didn't speak, but their hesitation was enough. One by one, they started backing away, their hands still on their holsters, but their faces full of doubt. The saloon, once filled with their taunts and jeers, was now filled with the weight of their fear. Jed kept his gun trained on them, his stance unwavering. He didn't trust them. Not yet. "Leave," he said, his voice low but firm. "And if you ever think about coming back to Gold Creek, you better think twice." The outlaws didn't argue. They turned and fled, their footsteps echoing out into the night. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the quiet of the saloon returned, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Jed's hand finally lowered, the revolver slipping back into its holster. He let out a slow breath, his muscles relaxing, his heart settling into its familiar rhythm. He wasn't looking for trouble, but if trouble found him, it would find a man who wasn't afraid to end it. The sound of the saloon door closing behind the retreating outlaws was a stark contrast to the tense stillness that filled the room. The patrons who had been watching from the sidelines, some cowering in fear, others in awe, now began to stir. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. Jed Calloway stood motionless, his hand still resting on the butt of his revolver. He didn't immediately holster the weapon. There was no need to rush. Not yet. The adrenaline was still lingering in his veins, the remnants of the danger that had passed. The air around him felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension that only a life-or-death moment could create. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. It wasn't often that a quiet bartender turned a saloon into a battlefield and then calmly returned to business as if nothing had happened. There was no boasting, no celebration, just the faint echo of a shot still reverberating through the wooden walls. Jed's eyes slowly scanned the room. They were all still there, the regulars, the gamblers, the card players. Some of them were looking at him like they were seeing a ghost, like they didn't know whether to feel relief, gratitude, or fear. The man at the far end of the bar, a miner with dirt-smeared clothes and a rough look in his eyes, was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse, as though he'd been holding his breath for the entire encounter. "Hell of a shot," he said, nodding toward the scarred man's body, now lying in a bloody heap on the floor. "Didn't think anyone could draw that fast. Didn't think anyone could stop those boys, neither." Jed didn't answer right away. He wasn't one for small talk. Instead, he took a slow breath, his eyes flicking to the dead man at his feet. His heart was still steady, his mind still clear, but there was a weight now, a heaviness in the pit of his stomach that he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't regret, it wasn't guilt, it was the quiet acknowledgement that, in this moment, something had changed, something had shifted in the air. He holstered the revolver and turned to the bar, grabbing a fresh glass and filling it with whiskey. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't need to. The glass was for him, not for anyone else. The saloon door creaked open again, and Jed's attention snapped toward it, his muscles tightening instinctively. But it wasn't the Outlaws returning. No, it was just another man, one of the town's regulars. He shuffled in, glancing around as he noticed the silence and the tension in the room. "What in tarnation happened here?" the man asked, his eyes wide as they took in the scene. He froze as he noticed the body, then quickly averted his gaze, clearly uncomfortable. "What did you do, Jed?" Jed's gaze remained steady as he slowly took a sip of the whiskey, his throat burning slightly as the amber liquid went down. He wasn't looking for answers. He wasn't looking for sympathy either. He knew exactly what he'd done. The others, however, seemed to want something from him, something he couldn't give them. "They pushed me," Jed said, his voice low and calm. "And they learned the hard way that some men don't like being pushed." The man at the bar, the miner, let out a low whistle and nodded. "That's one way to put it. Hell, I don't think anyone's ever stood up to those boys like that before." Jed didn't respond. His eyes were distant now, focused on the whiskey in his hand. The fire crackled behind him, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was something oddly peaceful about the moment, despite the chaos that had just unfolded. The regulars in the room were beginning to speak again, though the mood had shifted. Some were asking questions, others were just shaking their heads in disbelief. No one seemed particularly eager to leave, though. It was as if they all felt safer now, knowing that the quiet bartender who had kept to himself for so long had shown that he wasn't as harmless as they'd all assumed. But Jed wasn't interested in the conversation. He wasn't interested in anyone's admiration or fear. All he cared about was the silence, the peace that had come after the storm. He'd spent years running from the violence, trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. But tonight, the ghosts had caught up with him. They had dragged him back into the life he had left behind. And for the first time in a long time, Jed didn't mind. A few moments later, the sheriff of Gold Creek, a grizzled old man named Tom Willis, entered the saloon. He was a tall man, his face weathered from years of law-keeping, and his eyes sharp despite his age. He'd heard the gunshot, no doubt, and had come to see for himself what had happened. Tom looked at the dead outlaw, then at Jed, and for a long moment, he said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew Jed. He'd known him for years. Tom had heard the rumors, the stories of Jed's past, but he'd never asked. Everyone in town had kept their distance from Jed, and that was just how he liked it. "Looks like you handled things, Jed," the sheriff said, his voice low and rough. "I reckon I don't need to ask what happened. Word will get around fast enough, and I doubt anyone in Gold Creek will ever question you again." Jed met the sheriff's gaze, his expression unreadable. There was no pride, no relief in his eyes, just a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had passed. The fight had been won, but the past? That would always follow him. It had never really gone away. "I didn't do this for anyone else," Jed said finally, his voice steady and clear. "I did it because it needed to be done." Tom nodded slowly. He had heard that before, from men who had long since learned that the West had a way of demanding justice in the hardest possible ways. "Well," the sheriff said after a long silence, "I reckon we'll take care of the body. You're gonna need to explain yourself to the town, but I don't think anyone's gonna have much to say. They'll be grateful, sure as hell." Jed didn't answer. His gaze drifted back to the glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light from the fire. He wasn't worried about explanations. He didn't care about thanks. He'd done what needed to be done, and now it was over. For now, at least. The sheriff gave Jed a brief nod before stepping toward the door, his boots scraping the wooden floor. "I'll have someone clean up," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen more than his share of violence. "And you're right about one thing, Jed. This town won't forget what you did here tonight." Jed didn't acknowledge the sheriff's words. He simply turned back to the bar, his hands resting lightly on the counter, his fingers drumming an absent rhythm. His mind wasn't on the people in the room or the sheriff's words. It was on the path ahead. He had avoided this for so long. He had buried the man he once was deep inside, hidden beneath layers of whiskey and the hum of a quiet life. But now, the past had clawed its way to the surface, and there was no putting it back in the box. Jed's eyes flicked to the door as the sheriff left, a new wave of silence settling in behind him. For a moment, the saloon was eerily still. The other patrons, those who had witnessed the deadly draw, had scattered to their corners, murmuring among themselves. Their whispers were too low to catch, but Jed didn't need to hear them. He could feel their curiosity, their fear, their admiration. Some men might have basked in that attention, relished it, even, but not Jed. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had never wanted to be remembered for anything other than the simplicity of his life. But as the night wore on, Jed realized that wasn't going to happen. Gold Creek was a small town, and rumors spread quickly. By morning, every man, woman, and child in town would know exactly what had transpired in the Rusty Spur. They would hear about the quiet bartender who had taken down 5 outlaws with nothing but his hands and a gun. Some would glorify the story. Others would fear it. But Jed knew one thing for certain. His reputation had just been sealed. He glanced down at the glass in front of him, the whiskey now barely a memory as he swirled the amber liquid in the tumbler. His fingers caressed the rim as the fire crackled softly in the background. His mind wandered, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember the life he had left behind. The people in Gold Creek didn't know the full story of Jed Calloway. They didn't know about the gunfights he had walked away from, the outlaws he had once ridden with, or the towns he had burned to the ground. They didn't know the blood on his hands, the ghosts that haunted his every step. They had no idea what it had cost him to become the man he was now, and that was how he liked it. But now, the town would change. People would start asking questions. Strangers would come through Gold Creek, looking for the man who had killed 5 outlaws in one night. Some would come with admiration, others with ill intent. And Jed knew that soon enough, he would have to make a choice. Return to the life he had left behind, or continue hiding in the quiet corners of this small town, always looking over his shoulder. He had been running from the violence for years, but the violence wasn't done with him yet. The door to the saloon creaked open again, and Jed's eyes flicked toward it, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his side. This time, however, it wasn't a gang of outlaws or curious townsfolk. It was a woman. She stepped inside with a quiet grace, her boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. She was tall, with dark hair that cascaded down her back in waves, and her eyes were sharp, dark, and filled with a kind of knowing that immediately caught Jed's attention. She wasn't from Gold Creek. Jed would have remembered her. The woman's gaze scanned the room, locking onto him almost immediately. She moved toward the bar with purpose, her steps confident, but there was something cautious in her approach. She was no stranger to trouble, that much was clear. When she reached the bar, she gave Jed a small nod, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "You're Jed Calloway," she said, her voice low and smooth, though there was an edge to it. The quiet bartender. Jed didn't respond right away. He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. She wasn't here by accident. That much was certain. "And you are?" he asked finally, his voice steady but cool. The woman's smile didn't falter. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering even further. "I'm someone who's heard a lot about you, and I'm here to make sure you don't forget your past." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jed's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter. He had expected the rumors to catch up with him sooner or later, but he hadn't expected this, someone looking for him, seeking him out with purpose. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jed said, his tone flat. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "I think you do. You can only run for so long, Jed. Eventually, the past catches up with you." Jed's heart thudded in his chest, but his face remained impassive. He wasn't going to let this woman, whoever she was, see him sweat. He had spent too many years building this life, hiding behind the bar, to let anyone tear it down with a few well-chosen words. "I've got no past," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I'm just a bartender." The woman's eyes held his for a long moment, as if she were searching for something. Finally, she straightened, giving him one last look before turning to face the room. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, her voice carrying across the saloon. "I just need you to understand that the past never really stays buried. You'll see soon enough. It always finds its way out." She didn't say another word. She turned and walked toward the door, her boots clicking once more as she left the saloon. Jed watched her go, his mind already racing. What was she here for? What did she know? And how much of his past had she uncovered? The quiet of the saloon returned, but this time, it felt different. The peace that had settled in after the Outlaws left seemed fleeting now. The room was too small, the air too thick, and Jed couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change in a way he wasn't prepared for. For the first time in years, Jed wondered if his past was finally catching up with him. The door swung shut behind the woman, her heels tapping one last, decisive note against the floorboards before silence claimed the saloon once more. The fire in the hearth crackled, the glow dancing across Jed's face as his eyes followed her out into the night. Her words lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable, like a storm cloud on the horizon. "The past never stays buried." Jed's grip on his glass tightened, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface as he set it down with deliberate slowness. He wasn't a man given to panic. He'd weathered more storms than most men could imagine. But this felt different. His thoughts churned like a dark river, tugging at memories he had spent years burying deep within himself. Faces, names, the scent of gunpowder, the cold steel of a revolver pressed to the side of his own head, and the distant sound of horses galloping across a flat horizon. Those were the days when he had lived and breathed violence, when every moment was about survival, when every man who crossed him was a threat that had to be eliminated. But that was supposed to be over. Jed had left it behind. He had come to Gold Creek to escape the ghosts, to bury the past once and for all. He had become a quiet bartender, a man who watched the world go by, never seeking trouble. He had wanted peace, and for a while, he had found it. But the woman's words had cracked the fragile surface of that peace, revealing the storm that still raged inside him. "You can't outrun your past." The thought gnawed at him, and for a moment, the saloon seemed to close in around him. He could hear the faint whispers of the patrons, but their words were muffled, distant. His mind was elsewhere, back to a time when he was the one people feared, the one people whispered about in dark corners, the one who lived for the thrill of a quick draw. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Jed didn't have to look up to know it was the sheriff. Tom Willis had a way of moving through a room that made people take notice. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind, Jed," the sheriff said, his voice gruff but familiar. He took a seat at the bar, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Jed. "That woman who came in, what was that about?" Jed remained quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the untouched glass in front of him. He hadn't expected to talk about this, at least not with Tom. The sheriff wasn't a man who pried into other people's business. But Jed could feel the weight of the sheriff's eyes on him, the understanding between them unspoken. "You heard what she said," Jed replied finally, his voice low, measured. "She's got a way of making things feel heavy." Tom nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That she does. And from the look on your face, I can tell you're not exactly pleased to see her." Jed's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. The woman's words had struck a nerve, but Jed wasn't the kind of man to admit that easily. He wasn't used to letting anyone see beneath the surface. Not even Tom. "I've seen that look before," Tom said quietly. "It's the look of a man who's trying to outrun his past. But you know, Jed, sooner or later, that past catches up with you. And when it does, you have to face it." Jed's fingers drummed idly on the bar, but his thoughts were elsewhere, swirling back to the years he'd spent avoiding exactly this. He had tried so hard to forget, but no matter how far he ran, no matter how many times he changed towns or names, the past always found a way to slip through the cracks. "She said I'd see soon enough," Jed murmured, almost to himself. "That the past doesn't stay buried." Tom's gaze softened. "She's right, and you know it. But whether you face it head-on or wait for it to catch up with you, that's your choice. No one else can make it for you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Jed didn't want to admit it, but he knew the truth. The woman hadn't come to Gold Creek just to talk. She was here for something he wasn't prepared to face. He could feel it in his bones. The door creaked open again, this time with a soft whoosh of wind. Jed's hand instinctively moved to his holstered revolver, but it was only a few more townsfolk stepping inside, looking for a drink, a place to warm up. They glanced at him, their eyes full of curiosity, but none of them dared approach. Word had already spread about the Outlaws, about what Jed had done. For a brief moment, the saloon felt like it was holding its breath. The weight of the quiet had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the kind of calm Jed had grown used to. This was the kind of silence that came after a storm, when the air was thick and charged, just before the next wave of trouble came crashing in. Tom seemed to sense it too. He shifted in his seat, his face hardening slightly as he looked around the room. He didn't say anything more, but Jed could feel the shift in his posture. There was a weight on both of their shoulders now, an unspoken understanding that things weren't going to stay calm for long. "Jed," Tom said finally, breaking the silence, "you've always been a man who keeps to himself. I get that, but you can't outrun this forever. If you don't face it, it'll swallow you whole." Jed's gaze remained fixed on the glass in front of him, his mind racing through memories he thought he had buried. He didn't want to face the past. He didn't want to face the things he had done. The men he had killed, the law he had broken, the people he had left behind. But there was no denying it now. The past had found its way to Gold Creek, and the woman was just the beginning. He looked up at the sheriff, his eyes cold but resigned. "I know, Tom. I know." Tom gave him a long, considering look before standing. "I'll be around if you need me. But remember this, Jed. Gold Creek's a small town, and people talk. Whatever's coming for you, it's going to be here before you know it." Jed nodded, but he didn't respond. The sheriff's words had already been heard, and they weighed heavily on him. There was no running now, and deep down, Jed knew it. The night stretched on, but for Jed, time had slowed to a crawl. The saloon, once a familiar and comfortable place, now felt like a cage. The warmth from the fire could not melt the tension that had wrapped itself around his chest, and the flickering shadows on the walls seemed to mock him. The words of the woman echoed in his mind, louder now, drowning out the mundane sounds of the saloon. The past never stays buried, and no matter how much he had tried to bury it, it had resurfaced, taking root in Gold Creek. He wasn't sure if it was her eyes, or the weight of the quiet she carried with her, but when she had walked through that door, it had felt like everything in his life was about to unravel. Soon enough. What did she mean by that? What had she come for? Jed couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just some stranger in search of a drink. She had a purpose, something much deeper than a passing visit. She knew more than she was letting on. The saloon was still busy with patrons, though the noise had quieted. The atmosphere had shifted, the air now charged with whispers and sideways glances. People were nervous, unsure of what had just happened, and a few were smart enough to avoid catching Jed's eye. Some were still too afraid of the outlaws' bodies. Others just didn't know how to handle a man who had just killed 5 men in the blink of an eye. Jed reached for the whiskey bottle again, pouring himself another drink with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. His hand paused as the sound of the door creaked open once again. This time, Jed's eyes didn't dart toward it instinctively. He knew it was someone new, a stranger, and he didn't need to waste energy wondering what kind of trouble they might bring. His attention, his mind, was too far off, lost in the haze of memories and possibilities. But then, the voice came. "Well, well, well. Looks like we found him." The words cut through the noise of the saloon like a knife through butter. The voice was low, gravelly, filled with a dangerous sort of confidence. It sent a ripple of unease through the room, and for a brief moment, every eye in the saloon turned toward the door. Jed's fingers stilled on the bottle, his eyes narrowing slightly as the stranger stepped into view. The man was tall, dressed in a worn-out coat, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was flanked by two others, their faces hidden behind the shadows of the doorframe. They weren't outlaws, not exactly. Their movements were too sharp, too purposeful. These weren't the kind of men who wandered into town for a drink. They had come with intent. Jed's mind raced. He could already feel the shift in the room, the tension that had been simmering now coming to a boil. The air in the saloon felt heavier, charged with the weight of their presence. The stranger's eyes locked onto Jed's. There was something calculating in them, a predatory gleam that reminded Jed of something old, something he thought he had left behind. A familiar feeling stirred in the pit of his stomach, the kind that only came from years of staring death in the face. "You don't recognize me, do you, Calloway?" The stranger continued, a mocking smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Jed's eyes didn't leave the man, but his mind clicked into focus, his senses sharpening. The name had a faint echo to it, someone from his past. But Jed didn't give him the satisfaction of showing recognition, his face a mask of cool indifference. The stranger chuckled darkly as he took a few slow steps toward the bar, his boots scraping the floor with each deliberate step. "I guess you've forgotten all about it. But I haven't. You didn't leave your past behind as cleanly as you thought you did. And now, here I am, right where you left me." Jed's grip on the counter tightened. His pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. The man's words stung, not because of what he said, but because of the truth behind them. Jed had tried so hard to leave that life behind. The bloodshed, the chaos, the endless pursuit of survival. He had run for so long, hoping that a quiet life in a quiet town would be enough to make it all go away. But now, here it was again. The past, standing right in front of him. The stranger leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Jed's face. "I don't know if you remember me, Calloway, but I sure as hell remember you. You've made a lot of enemies in your time." Jed's heart was steady, his mind clear, but the past he'd buried so deep was clawing its way back to the surface. He had been a killer once. No hesitation, no mercy. He had made his living by the draw of a gun, taking out anyone who stood in his way. He had crossed paths with too many men like this one. Men who wanted revenge, men who wanted payback. "Your name's not familiar," Jed said slowly, his voice calm, betraying nothing. "But I can guess why you're here." The stranger grinned, leaning back slightly, his hands resting on the bar as he sized Jed up. "You've been hiding long enough, but you can't hide forever. We've come for what's ours, Calloway. You don't just walk away from a life like yours and expect the world to forget." Jed didn't flinch. The weight of the man's words settled on him like a heavy blanket, but he didn't let it show. He had been through too much to let a few more threats rattle him. His life, as violent and unforgiving as it had been, was over, wasn't it? "I'm not that man anymore," Jed said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I left that life behind." The stranger's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Then it was back, wider, more dangerous. "You can leave the gunslinging behind, Calloway, but you can't leave the consequences. The past doesn't forget." The man motioned to his companions, who stepped forward with a fluid, synchronized movement. One reached for his belt, where a gun rested, his fingers twitching in anticipation. Jed's hand moved subtly, his fingers brushing the grip of his own revolver. He didn't want this. He didn't want to do this again. But he could feel the storm on the horizon, gathering strength. The quiet was gone now, replaced by the buzz of fear and excitement. The entire saloon seemed to hold its breath. Even the regulars who had been so comfortable moments before were now tense, their eyes darting from Jed to the strangers, waiting for something to break. "I told you," Jed said quietly, "the past doesn't own me anymore." But as he said it, he wasn't sure if he believed it. Not anymore. The man's eyes gleamed with cold amusement as he watched Jed's fingers hover just above the revolver at his side. The moment stretched out, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. The saloon was now fully aware that something terrible was about to unfold. The regulars had long since stopped pretending that everything was normal. They were watching, waiting, their hands twitching at their sides, ready to make a break for it if necessary. Jed's thoughts were moving faster than his body, but his training kicked in with precision. The stillness of the moment felt like it had lasted an eternity, but Jed knew better. It was just a breath, and in that breath, the world could change. "You think you can walk away from this?" The man took another step closer to the bar, his voice thick with malice. "We don't forget what you did. You can try and hide here, in this little hole in the ground, but it won't save you." Jed's grip tightened on his glass. He wasn't going to let the past drag him back. Not tonight. But the truth was, he didn't know how much longer he could run. He had made his choice when he pulled that trigger on the 5 outlaws earlier. The past had already caught up with him. And now, this man, whoever he was, had come to collect. Jed's eyes flicked toward the door for a split second. The street outside was dark, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of distant coyotes. But even with the door to freedom just a few feet away, Jed knew he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't about to leave. Not like this. He'd already fought one battle tonight, and he wasn't about to turn his back on another one. He had learned the hard way, long ago, that when you run, you keep running. But if you stand your ground, the fight can be over before it ever truly begins. "Who are you?" Jed's voice was measured, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. "And what the hell do you want with me?" The man's grin widened, and he let out a low chuckle. "Don't you remember? You've left a trail of bodies in your wake, Calloway. You think that kind of blood doesn't follow you?" Jed's mind raced. A trail of bodies? There had been so many, over the years. So many men who had tried to take him down, or take what was his. But he couldn't place this man's face. Not yet. But something about the way he spoke, the way he held himself, struck a nerve. Jed had made a lot of enemies, but this one felt different. "I don't remember you," Jed said slowly, his fingers inching closer to his revolver. "But it's clear that you're looking for something. And it's not just a drink." The man took one more step forward, and his companions flanked him, moving in time, as though they had done this 100 times before. The younger man on his left had his hand resting just above his own holster, his fingers twitching with anticipation. The man on the right, older, with a scar running down his cheek, eyed Jed with cold, assessing gaze. "We want payment, Calloway," the man said, his voice steady. "You've got blood on your hands, and we're here to make sure it gets paid for. All those lives you took? It's time you settled up." Jed's mind flashed back, the faces of his past rising like ghosts, each one more haunting than the last. He had made mistakes, sure, but he had been a different man then. A man who had to survive by any means necessary. He had been part of a world where violence ruled, where men like him had no choice but to draw first. Now, in the quiet of Gold Creek, he was no longer that man. He had tried so hard to bury that side of him, but it was clear. His past had followed him. It always did. "I didn't take anything that wasn't mine," Jed replied, his voice low, but his heart starting to beat a little faster as he measured the thread in front of him. "And I don't owe you a damn thing." The man let out a slow, almost mocking sigh. "You really think you can hide from your past forever, Calloway? You think it's just gonna disappear because you're hiding behind a bar?" The words hit harder than Jed expected. It was like a punch to the gut. He could feel the weight of them, the heaviness of his past that had followed him through every town, every saloon, every moment of peace he'd ever found. And now, standing in front of him, was a reminder that peace was just an illusion. There was no running. "You're not in control here," Jed said, his voice sharpening. "You can make threats all you want, but I'm not the man I used to be." You think you can intimidate me into running again? You're wrong." The man's eyes flicked to his companions, and in that moment, Jed knew. The moment had come. There was no more pretending. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about payback. It was about one thing: control. The man was trying to regain control over Jed, trying to force him into a corner where his only option was to fight or flee. But Jed had already decided. He wasn't going to flee again. The younger man moved first, his hand darting toward his holster in one swift motion. But Jed was already faster. The cold, sharp draw of his gun was second nature. His revolver came to life in his hand, and with a crack that seemed to split the very air, the younger man's hand jerked back, the gun falling from his grip before he could even get the barrel pointed in Jed's direction. The room seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. The man stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock, the pain in his arm already seeping through the fabric of his coat. Jed's eyes never left him. He was already focused on the older man to his right, watching as he slowly reached for his own gun, eyes narrowed, muscles tense. But Jed was faster. A blur of motion, a flick of the wrist, and the man was on the ground before he could even draw. His revolver slipped from his grasp, and the room went deathly quiet. The remaining man, the leader, took a half step back, his eyes flicking between his fallen comrades and Jed, his hand still hovering near his holster. Jed's gaze locked on him, unblinking, unwavering. He had seen this before. The hesitation, the fear. "Get out of here," Jed said, his voice cold, dead calm. For a moment, the man wavered, his eyes full of uncertainty. But then, with a final glance at his fallen companions, he turned and bolted, his boots pounding against the floor as he fled out the door. The saloon remained still, the silence hanging thick in the air, broken only by the sound of Jed's steady breathing. He had done it again. He had made his stand. But this time, it felt different. This time, the fight wasn't over. The past was still there, lingering in the shadows. And it wasn't done with him yet. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the saloon. But the silence that followed was more oppressive than the crash of wood against wood. Jed stood alone in the center of the room, his gun still drawn and steady in his hand. His breathing was measured, almost controlled, as his eyes scanned the faces of the few remaining patrons who hadn't fled the moment the guns had started speaking. They were all watching him, some with wide eyes, others in awe, and a few, like the older miner sitting by the corner, with a quiet respect. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sounds in the saloon were the distant creak of the floorboards as the wind swept through the cracks in the old building and the slow, measured crackle of the fire in the hearth. Jed's hand remained on the revolver, but the immediate danger had passed. The outlaws were gone, at least for now. But the adrenaline that had coursed through his veins just moments before was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow, gnawing emptiness in its place. The room seemed to shift, becoming both too small and too large at once, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had drawn faster than anyone thought he could. He had proven to himself that he was still the same man he had once been. But the victory felt hollow. The past had been forced into the light again, and it had left its mark. Jed holstered his revolver, the soft click of the leather snapping back into place almost deafening in the stillness. He took a slow breath, letting the tension slowly leave his shoulders as he turned toward the bar. His hand reached for the bottle of whiskey, the smooth glass cold under his fingertips. There was no celebration in it, no triumph, just a quiet need for something to ground him. He poured a glass and took a long, deliberate sip, the burn of the liquor doing little to settle the storm inside him. He had done what he had to do. The outlaws were gone, but the feeling of eyes still on him lingered. He could feel the weight of the town's gaze, the murmur of their unspoken thoughts. What would they say? Would they see him as the man who saved Gold Creek, or the killer who had brought his past with him? The old ghosts would not stay silent. They never did. The miner, the one who had spoken earlier, cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched out for what felt like hours. "You did what needed to be done," he said quietly, his voice gruff but laced with understanding. "There ain't a man in this town who'd argue that. You handled 'em better than most would've, Jed." Jed didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the glass in front of him. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't looking for thanks. But the words of the miner, the quiet respect in his voice, did something to him. They made him feel, for the first time in a long while, like maybe he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The sheriff had already left, but Jed knew Tom wouldn't be far behind. The man had seen enough of the world to know when someone needed space to think. And tonight, Jed needed all the space he could get. The wind picked up outside, howling through the cracks in the saloon's wooden walls. Jed closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar sound of the wind wash over him. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was as close as he could get. There was a soft shuffle behind him, the faint sound of boots on the wooden floor, and when he turned, he found that the woman, the one who had come into the saloon earlier, was standing near the door, watching him. Her eyes were steady, unwavering, and there was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel both seen and unseen at once. She hadn't left, even after everything had happened. "Didn't think I'd see you still here," Jed said, his voice low, guarded. He hadn't expected her to come back. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You weren't expecting me to run, were you?" Jed said nothing, but the question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. What did she want from him? He had a lot of questions for her, but he wasn't sure where to start. "I should have known you'd handle that," she said quietly, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. "You always were good at handling the messes you made." Jed stiffened slightly, his hand instinctively tightening around the glass. "You don't know me," he said, his voice cold. "Don't I?" she replied, her lips curling into a faint smile. "I know enough. I know the kind of man you were. And I know the kind of man you're still running from." He stood still for a moment, trying to rein in the flicker of rage that threatened to ignite at her words. She didn't understand. She couldn't. The life he'd lived, the choices he'd made, they weren't things you just walked away from. "I'm not that man anymore," Jed said, his voice tight. "I've done my time." She studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "The past doesn't let go that easily, Jed. You can try and bury it, but it'll always find a way to surface. You should know that by now." Jed didn't reply. There was nothing more to say. He had been running for so long that it had become second nature. But he was tired. Tired of running. Tired of pretending he was someone he wasn't. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't have to keep fighting it, you know? You can choose to face it, or you can keep running. But I think you know, deep down, that one day, you won't be able to run anymore." Jed swallowed, his throat tight, but he didn't let her see how her words had affected him. He didn't owe her an explanation, but in the back of his mind, the question lingered, heavy and oppressive. "What do you do when you can't run anymore?" "Maybe it's time to stop running," she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "Maybe it's time to start living." Jed took another sip of his whiskey, letting the burn settle in his chest. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know what would come next. But he did know one thing for certain. Whatever was coming, it was going to find him. And he wasn't going to run anymore. The silence that followed her words felt like a thick fog, settling over the saloon and clouding Jed's mind. She was still standing there, close to the door, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made it feel like she was reaching into his soul and pulling out the things he had buried deep within, the things he'd hoped would stay buried forever. He didn't respond right away. There were no easy answers. He didn't have the words to give her, not in this moment, but the weight of her gaze, the challenge in her voice, it tugged at something inside him, a knot of old regrets and forgotten desires that he had spent years trying to ignore. The past never stays buried. It was a thought that kept repeating itself in his mind, like a broken record, louder now. The people in Gold Creek, the people he'd come to trust, would never see him the same way again. They wouldn't see the quiet bartender who had poured their drinks and offered them a safe space. No, now they would see him as something else. A killer. A man with a past too dark to forget. And maybe she was right. Maybe he wasn't running anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop pretending that the man he had been had disappeared. Because, deep down, Jed knew that the ghosts would always follow. The woman, who still hadn't moved, seemed to understand. There was a quiet resolve in her eyes now, a softness that hadn't been there before. She wasn't here to judge him, not really. She had seen enough of men like him in her time, men who had been shaped by violence, by choices they could never take back. Finally, Jed broke the silence. "Why are you still here?" His voice was rough, his throat tight, but he managed to meet her eyes without flinching. Her lips quirked slightly. "I came for you, didn't I?" He stiffened at her words, but she raised a hand, a gesture to stop him from speaking. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Jed. I'm here because you need help." Jed shook his head. "I don't need anyone's help." The woman's expression softened, but there was no pity in her eyes, only understanding. "You've been running long enough, haven't you? But now, it's time to face it. It's time to stop running. I've faced enough," Jed muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. He was tired, so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of hiding, tired of feeling like every step he took was just one more step away from the man he had once been. "You've only faced what you wanted to face, Jed," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But the real reckoning is coming. The past doesn't let go that easily. It's going to find you no matter where you go." He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his throat, but they didn't matter anymore. The truth had been laid bare between them, and there was no escaping it. She was right. It wasn't just the men who came looking for him. It was the life he had led, the choices he had made. The door to the saloon creaked open once more, and Jed's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his side, his fingers brushing the grip, his body going tense. But when he turned, he saw the sheriff standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. Tom Willis. Jed hadn't expected him to return tonight. "You're still here," the sheriff said, his voice low, like he wasn't entirely sure whether it was a question or a statement. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him and giving Jed a brief, knowing look. The woman by the door didn't move, but Jed could feel her presence behind him like a shadow. Tom had seen enough of Jed to know when the man needed space, but tonight was different. Tonight, the quiet tension in the room was thicker than ever. "You heard the shots," Jed said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Tom nodded, stepping further into the room. He surveyed the scene, noting the quiet aftermath of the fight. The bodies of the outlaws had been removed, but the tension still hung in the air, as if the past few minutes had been etched into the walls of the Rusty Spur. "You know," Tom began, his voice almost casual, "the folks around here are talking. They're saying things they probably shouldn't." Jed didn't respond. He didn't need to. "They're scared, Jed," Tom continued, his gaze flicking to the woman by the door, then back to Jed. "They saw what you did, and they don't know if they should be thankful or afraid. You've got a reputation now." "I don't care about their reputation," Jed muttered, his hand still resting on the bar, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "I think you do," Tom said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I think you care more than you want to admit." Jed met the sheriff's gaze. He had spent so many years running, hiding from the man he used to be, but now, here it was, laid out before him, raw and undeniable. The fear in the town, the whispers in the streets. He had tried so hard to escape it all, but it was clear that no matter how hard he ran, it would always be there. "I didn't ask for this," Jed said quietly, his voice thick with frustration. "I didn't ask to be the man everyone's afraid of." Tom didn't flinch. He had seen Jed struggle with this before, in different ways, at different times. The struggle between the man you were and the man you were trying to be. "No one asks for a reputation, Jed, but it's yours now. And whether you like it or not, you're gonna have to decide what to do with it." The words hung heavy in the air. Jed's throat tightened, and he could feel the weight of them. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It wasn't just about keeping his head down and pouring whiskey. This was about facing what was coming, whether he was ready for it or not. The woman by the door spoke up then, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You can't run anymore, Jed. You can stay in Gold Creek, or you can leave. But either way, you'll have to face what's coming." Jed's eyes flicked to her, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't know what she knew. He didn't know what her purpose here really was. But something in her voice, something in the way she said it, made him realize that it wasn't just the outlaws who were coming for him. The reckoning had already begun. The saloon seemed to grow smaller, tighter, the shadows closing in on Jed. He wasn't used to feeling cornered. For years, he had walked through life with a steady, unflinching resolve, always keeping 1 foot ahead of whatever danger had tried to find him. But now, it felt like the storm was gathering, and this time, he wasn't sure he'd be able to outrun it. The woman's words echoed in his mind, even louder now. You can't run anymore. And somewhere, deep in his gut, Jed knew she was right. It wasn't the outlaws he had to worry about anymore. It was the past. The reckoning that had been following him for so long was no longer a distant threat. It was at his doorstep, waiting. Tom's eyes narrowed as he watched Jed. He'd known Jed for years, and the sheriff could read him like a book. He could tell when Jed was fighting something deeper than just the world outside. I know what you're thinking, Jed, Tom said softly. You're thinking you can just disappear again. Move on. Leave it all behind like you've done so many times before. But it doesn't work that way, not anymore. Jed didn't look at him. Instead, he stared at the whiskey bottle on the bar, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of his glass. He wanted to tell Tom he was wrong, that he could leave, that he could walk out the door and never look back. But he knew deep down that the world wasn't so simple anymore. It wasn't about escaping. It was about surviving. And survival meant facing what you feared most. What do you want from me, Tom? Jed's voice was low, rough. The weight of the question hung between them, heavy with the unspoken history they shared. He wasn't asking the sheriff for advice. He wasn't asking for comfort. He was simply trying to make sense of the mess he had found himself in. Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a long, slow look around the saloon. It was quiet now, too quiet. The patrons who had been witnesses to the recent chaos were still lingering at the edges, too afraid to speak but too curious to leave. Tom's gaze lingered on the woman who stood near the door, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She's right, you know, Tom said finally, his eyes flicking back to Jed. You've made a name for yourself here in Gold Creek, and it's a name you can't just walk away from. Jed clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what he hated more, the fact that Tom was right or the fact that, in this moment, he couldn't run anymore. So what do you want me to do, Sheriff? Jed asked, finally turning to face him. The frustration in his voice was unmistakable. You think I can just walk back into the town, wave a flag, and make everything go back to how it was? Tom's eyes softened, but his words were still hard. You're gonna have to face what's coming, Jed. You can't hide behind this bar forever. The woman by the door spoke then, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Tom's right, Jed. The past is coming for you, and you can't outrun it this time. Jed's gaze shot to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Who are you, really? He asked, his voice tight with suspicion. He wasn't sure if he trusted her, but there was something in her eyes that made him uneasy, something that told him she knew more about him than anyone should. She didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if she was considering the question herself. I'm someone who knows how this story goes. I've seen it before, Jed. I've seen men like you. Men who think they can bury their pasts and live in the quiet. But it doesn't work that way. It never does. Jed's fingers tightened around his glass, but he didn't say anything. The words she spoke, though unsettling, rang with a certain truth. His past wasn't just a collection of memories he could shut away in some dark corner of his mind. It was a force, a shadow that had followed him from town to town, from life to life. And now, that shadow had finally caught up to him. Tom's voice broke the silence. You don't have to face it alone, Jed, he said, his tone softer now. But you do have to face it. There's no running anymore. Jed's gaze lingered on Tom for a moment, then shifted to the woman. She was watching him closely, her expression calm but resolute. She wasn't going to leave until she got the answers she was looking for. And Jed knew it. He didn't have the luxury of turning away, not anymore. Not with everything at stake. A deep sigh escaped him, a sound of resignation. So what do you think I should do? He asked, his voice quieter now, as though he was starting to entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was no more running. You think I should just walk out there and face whatever's waiting for me? The woman didn't hesitate. Yes, it's the only way. You can keep hiding, or you can take control. But it starts with facing the truth. Jed took a slow drink from his glass, his mind racing. The idea of walking out into the unknown, of confronting whatever demons had been chasing him for so long, terrified him. But the thought of running again? Of hiding in the shadows for the rest of his life? That was a nightmare he couldn't live with. He placed the glass down slowly, his fingers lingering on the edge of the empty tumbler. For the first time in years, Jed Calloway felt something. Something deeper than the fear or the anger that had always fueled him. It was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a long time. Hope. Not the kind of hope that promised easy answers, but the kind that came from accepting who you really were. From facing the past and taking responsibility for it. I don't know what's coming next, Jed said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. But I'm done running. The woman's eyes softened, just for a moment. Then let's go, she said, her voice calm and unwavering. Tom gave Jed a final look, his expression unreadable. You know where to find me if you need help? Jed didn't respond, but he gave the sheriff a nod, acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. He turned toward the door, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his past lifting, not because he was outrunning it, but because he was finally ready to face it. And when he stepped out into the cold night, he didn't know what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't face it alone. The cold night air hit Jed like a slap to the face as he stepped through the door of the Rusty Spur, his boots sinking into the dusty street of Gold Creek. The town, small as it was, had never felt this heavy, this suffocating, until now. Every step he took seemed to echo in the stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. He wasn't sure where to go, or even what to do next, but he knew one thing. Running was no longer an option. The woman's words still echoed in his mind, and the sheriff's quiet advice had settled in the pit of his stomach like a weight he couldn't shake off. The past had always been a ghost, a thing he could outrun, but not anymore. It was standing in front of him now, waiting for him to make the next move. The town was quiet, as most small towns were at this hour. The lights in the windows were dim, the usual hustle and bustle of the day now replaced by an eerie calm. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what Jed would do next. He wasn't sure what he expected, but as he walked down the street, he could feel the eyes of the town on him. They weren't directly looking at him, but there was a quiet awareness that settled in the air. Word had already spread about what had happened at the Rusty Spur, the outlaws, the gunfight, and the quiet bartender who had taken them down. And with that came the whispers. Jed had never been a man for attention, and now, with the weight of his past on full display, it felt almost suffocating. He tried to ignore the feeling, focusing instead on the task ahead. There was no turning back now. As he walked, he could feel the woman's presence behind him, a quiet shadow following in his footsteps. She hadn't spoken much since they left the saloon, but her quiet confidence was undeniable. She was walking alongside him, but at a distance, allowing him the space to think. And he appreciated that. The streets of Gold Creek were empty except for the occasional flicker of light in the windows, casting long shadows against the buildings. The air was still, and for the first time in a long while, Jed found himself thinking about the things he had left behind. He hadn't realized how much he had buried until now, the life he had tried to escape, the choices he had made. It all came rushing back, a flood of memories he wasn't ready to face. But face them he must. He stopped in front of a small house at the edge of town, a building that had once felt like a sanctuary, but now felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. It was here that he had made the decision to change, to leave behind the man he had been. It was here, too, that he had been haunted by his choices, by the life that had come with the gun he carried. The woman stopped a few paces behind him, her gaze never leaving his back. Jed could feel her watching him, waiting. She knew this was the moment. He could sense it in the air, the shift in the world around him. This wasn't just a walk down the street. This was a reckoning. He took a deep breath and turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken, something that told him she had been where he was, had faced the same demons, had carried the same weight. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low but steady. He wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He was simply searching for the truth in her eyes. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Because you can't do this alone, Jed. Not anymore." His eyes flickered away for a moment, then back to her. He could see the sincerity in her expression, the quiet resolve that told him she wasn't here for some personal gain. She was here because she knew what it felt like to be trapped by your past, to be bound by your own choices. "I don't need saving," he said, the words coming out more firmly than he felt. "You've been saving yourself for a long time," she replied softly. "But sometimes the weight of it is too much. Sometimes you need to stop running and start facing it." Jed swallowed hard, the words sinking in deeper than he expected. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, ready to face the consequences of a life he had left behind. But he was tired of running, tired of pretending like everything was fine. He had buried too many things, and now it was time to unearth them. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, the vulnerability slipping into his voice for the first time. She stepped closer, her eyes softening with understanding. "You don't have to do it alone, Jed, but you do have to face it. The past won't stay buried forever. It never does." Jed nodded slowly, his mind racing. The silence between them grew, heavy with unspoken thoughts. And then, without another word, he turned and stepped up to the porch of the small house, his hand resting on the worn wooden railing. For a moment, nothing moved. The world felt still, as if holding its breath. Jed reached for the door, his hand on the cold brass doorknob. He hesitated for a heartbeat, and then pushed it open. Inside, the house was exactly as he remembered, small, modest, but with the same familiar warmth that had once made it a home. The furniture was old, worn from years of use, but there was still a certain comfort in it. The silence inside was the same as it had always been, quiet, peaceful, but now it felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The woman followed him inside, but didn't speak. She allowed him the space to absorb it all, to let the weight of his past settle over him. Jed stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. The house, the memories, the echoes of the life he had tried to leave behind. Finally, he turned to face her. "I can't keep running," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my whole life running, but I can't do it anymore." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "No, you can't." And in that moment, Jed knew that this was the beginning of something new. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but something he was going to face, nonetheless. The past would always be with him, but it no longer had control. He wasn't running anymore. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the small house. Inside, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Jed stood in the center of it all, his boots planted firmly on the worn wooden floor. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew that this moment was the beginning of something he couldn't turn back from. The woman, he still didn't know her name, had given him space to think. She stood by the door, watching him, her presence a constant reminder that he wasn't alone in this anymore. Whatever it was that had drawn her here, whatever she had seen in him, she had come to help him face it. And for the first time in years, Jed felt a strange sense of gratitude for that. He turned toward the fireplace, watching the flames dance in the hearth. The flickering orange light cast strange shadows on the walls, as if the past itself was reaching out to grab hold of him. He could feel it. The ghosts of his former life, the men he had killed, the towns he had left behind, the choices that had led him here. They were all still there, waiting, and Jed had no idea how to make them go away. But running was no longer an option. The woman stepped forward, her footsteps quiet but resolute. "You've taken the first step, Jed," she said softly, her voice like the wind outside, steady, unyielding. "The hardest one. You've stopped running." Jed's eyes flicked toward her. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, and there was something in it that reminded him of the man he used to be, the one who had faced down every danger, every threat, with no fear in his heart. "I'm not sure what's coming next," he said, his voice rough, "but I can feel it. It's coming." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "It's already here." Jed swallowed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The past had always been a shadow, something he could keep behind him. But now it was front and center, taking shape in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had killed men in the past, sure. He had fought battles and made enemies, but he had never imagined that one day he would have to confront it all head-on. "I've never been good at this," Jed admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "Facing the things I've done. I don't know where to start." The woman stepped closer to him, her gaze never leaving his face. "Start by owning it. You don't need to fix everything in one night. You just need to face it. The guilt, the shame, all of it. It's the only way forward." Jed's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to face it. He didn't want to remember the men he had killed. The men who had been just as lost as he had been, just as desperate. But he knew she was right. The only way to move forward was to stop running from the past. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching his. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, his mind racing. What had he been running from all these years? What had he been afraid of? Was it the guilt of his actions? The lives he had taken? Or was it the truth that lay at the heart of it all? He was just as broken as the men he had killed? "I don't know if I'm ready," Jed said finally, his voice hoarse. "But I don't have a choice anymore, do I?" The woman smiled faintly, a soft, understanding smile. "No, you don't." There was a long silence between them, the air thick with unspoken thoughts and emotions. For the first time, Jed felt the weight of his past lifting slightly, not because it was gone, but because he was facing it. He had spent so many years trying to bury it, trying to escape it, but now he was standing right in the middle of it. And it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning. The woman stepped back, her gaze still steady. "There's a reckoning coming, Jed. You don't have to face it alone, but you have to face it. And you have to be ready when it comes." Jed nodded slowly, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. He didn't know what was waiting for him. He didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. "I'll be ready," he said quietly, his voice firm. "Whatever happens next, I'll face it." She nodded, a faint approval in her eyes. "That's all you can do." The door to the house creaked open then, and Jed's hand instinctively moved to his gun. But it wasn't an enemy who stepped inside. It was Tom, the sheriff. "You still here?" Tom's voice was low, but there was a certain relief in it. "I thought you might have headed out by now." Jed didn't move at first. He was still trying to process everything. The decision to face his past, the reality of what was coming. He wasn't sure if he was ready to deal with what Tom had to say, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. "I'm not going anywhere," Jed replied, his voice steady. "I've got something to take care of." Tom gave him a long look, then nodded slowly, as if he understood more than Jed had said. "I don't know what's going on in that head of yours, Jed," Tom said, his voice quiet. "But you're right. You don't have to face it alone. But you've got to face it. You've got a lot of folks in this town who are counting on you." Jed's eyes flickered to the woman, and she gave him a small nod. She was right. He wasn't alone in this. It had taken him too long to realize it, but he wasn't walking this path alone anymore. "Thanks, Tom," Jed said finally, his voice full of something deeper than gratitude. An acknowledgement that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Gold Creek, about the people who had put their trust in him, whether he had wanted it or not. Tom gave a small smile, but it was full of understanding. "Anytime, Jed. Just make sure you're ready." Jed took a deep breath, then turned back to the door. His hand brushed over the worn handle, the weight of it grounding him. The past was a heavy burden, but the only way to move forward was to face it. He knew that now, and with that thought, he stepped out into the night, ready for whatever was coming next. The cool night air was biting as Jed stepped back outside, the door of the small house closing softly behind him. The wind had picked up, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust through the narrow streets of Gold Creek. He could hear the distant howl of coyotes, the only sound that pierced the stillness of the night. For a moment, he stood there, the weight of the past heavy on his shoulders. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, even though they were nowhere to be seen. It was as if the very air had shifted, the quiet anticipation hanging in the wind. He wasn't sure what he was looking for out there, or what he expected to find, but he knew one thing. The reckoning had begun. The woman from the saloon, who had not yet shared her name, but had made it clear she knew more about him than most, was still with him. She hadn't said much after Tom had arrived, but Jed could feel her presence at his back. She wasn't the type to demand answers, but he could tell she wasn't going anywhere either. Tom had said the truth, and it still echoed in Jed's mind. You've got a lot of folks in this town who are counting on you. It wasn't the first time someone had said that, but this time, it carried more weight. He had avoided his responsibility for so long, clinging to the idea of a quiet life where no one knew his past, where he could hide behind the counter of the Rusty Spur. But he couldn't escape anymore. It had followed him into the heart of Gold Creek, and now it was here to stay. The woman's voice cut through the silence, soft but firm. You know this isn't going to be easy, don't you? Jed's shoulders tensed as he glanced over his shoulder, meeting her gaze for the first time since he had stepped out the door. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew. She knew exactly what he was about to face. I'm not expecting it to be easy, Jed replied quietly, but it's time to face it. It's time to stop running. She stepped closer, her boots silent on the dirt road. The past doesn't let go that easily. And it's not just your past you have to face. It's theirs too. Jed didn't ask who they were, because he already knew. The Outlaws. The men who had followed him here, those who had a score to settle. The ones who had been waiting for him to slip up. The ones he had left behind, but who had never let go of the promise of revenge. I know, Jed muttered, his voice heavy with the truth of it, but I've made my peace with it. I can't run anymore. The woman nodded, her face unreadable. You're stronger than you think, Jed. The strength you need isn't in running. It's in facing what's coming and owning it. Jed didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to break through the darkness. The world was starting to wake up, just as he was, waking up to the reality of who he was and who he needed to be. A voice broke the silence, a familiar one. You're going to need a little more than strength, Jed. Tom's voice came from behind him, steady and sure. If you're planning to face what's coming, you're going to need all the help you can get. Jed turned to face Tom, who had come to stand beside him. The sheriff's weathered face was serious, but there was a quiet sense of solidarity in his gaze. He didn't say anything more, just stood there, waiting for Jed's response. Jed looked between Tom and the woman, both of them standing on either side of him. It wasn't just his fight anymore. He could feel it, deep down. The town had a stake in what was about to happen, and whether he liked it or not, he was the one who would have to carry it. He took a long breath, squaring his shoulders. Then let's get it over with. Tom gave a slow nod. It's not going to be easy, Jed. They'll be looking for you. They won't stop until they find you. I know, Jed said quietly, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. But I'm done running. I'll face them, one way or another. The woman stepped up beside him, her eyes steady. That's the spirit, she said, her voice soft but resolute. But remember, you don't have to do it alone. Jed gave a brief glance at her, a slight nod of acknowledgement. She wasn't wrong. He had spent years convincing himself that he could face the world alone, that he didn't need anyone else. But the reality was different now, and as much as he hated to admit it, he needed the help of the people around him. The fire that had been smoldering inside him for so long, a fire of regret, anger, and shame, was beginning to shift. It wasn't as hot as it once was, but it was a steady warmth, and for the first time, it felt like it might be enough to guide him through the coming storm. The three of them stood there for a moment, the silence settling in around them. The wind had died down, and the world felt still, as though it was waiting for the next move. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the town. Jed looked around at the familiar buildings of Gold Creek, the saloon, the general store, the houses scattered across the dirt streets. The town was quiet, but he knew that wouldn't last. The reckoning was coming, and it wouldn't be long before it reached Gold Creek. "Let's go," Jed said finally, his voice steady. Together, they walked down the dirt road, their footsteps soft against the earth. The woman led the way, her pace confident, as if she knew exactly what was ahead. Tom was beside Jed, his presence a silent reassurance. The sun had risen fully now, and the town of Gold Creek was bathed in the soft glow of morning light. But as they walked, Jed knew the light wouldn't last. The storm was coming, and with it, the past he had been running from for so long. But for the first time in years, Jed didn't feel afraid. He was ready. The streets of Gold Creek felt smaller than they had before, the buildings looming over Jed as he walked through town. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the weight of his past and the responsibility that had been thrust upon him pressing down like a 1,000-pound stone. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt road, and the town felt still, almost too still. The woman led the way, her steps sure and steady. She hadn't said much since they left the house, but Jed knew she was with him. There was no hesitation in her gait, no fear in her eyes, only an unspoken understanding. She had seen what Jed was about to face, and though she wasn't from this town, she seemed more sure of it than anyone else. Tom walked beside Jed, his steady presence like a rock in a raging river. The sheriff didn't speak much either, but Jed could feel the quiet strength in him, the same resolve that had kept Gold Creek safe for years. But Jed knew that this time, the threat wasn't from the usual troublemakers or the occasional brawl. It was from something darker, something more personal. They reached the edge of town, where the first few outlaws had already gathered. Jed could see the faint silhouettes of men standing under the fading light, their figures sharp against the horizon. They were waiting for him. Jed's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his side, but he didn't draw it yet. He was ready. He had been ready for this moment ever since the outlaws had stepped into the Rusty Spur, mocking him and testing him. Now, he was walking toward them, not as the bartender hiding behind a counter, but as the man he had always been deep inside. The woman stopped ahead, turning to face him. Her eyes were calm, but there was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel like this moment had been coming for a long time. "You don't have to do this alone, Jed," she said, her voice low and steady. Jed's gaze softened for a brief moment. She wasn't just standing with him out of obligation. She was here because she knew what it was like to face your past, to carry the weight of your mistakes. And for the first time, Jed wasn't so sure he could have made it this far without her. "I'm not alone," he said quietly, glancing toward Tom, who had stopped a few steps behind. "Not anymore." The woman smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. She stepped back, giving him space as the wind kicked up, sending dust swirling around them. "Remember," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising gusts, "this isn't just about fighting. It's about facing the truth." Jed didn't need to hear more. He had heard it in his own thoughts already. It wasn't just the outlaws who were coming for him. It was his past. All the mistakes, the bloodshed, the things he had done to survive. He wasn't running from it anymore. As they approached the outlaws, Jed could feel the tension in the air thickening. The men ahead of him were spread out across the dirt road, their guns resting loosely in their hands. They weren't in a hurry, but there was an unmistakable sense of purpose about them. They had come for Jed, and they weren't going to leave until they had what they came for. The leader, the same man who had taunted him in the Rusty Spur, stepped forward, a crooked grin on his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "Look who decided to show up. You ready to pay for your sins, Calloway?" Jed's eyes narrowed. The man's words were like a trigger, something that snapped inside him. He had heard all of this before. The threats, the insults, the hollow bravado. But this time, he wasn't the man who would back down. "I've already paid," Jed said, his voice low but firm. "But you don't get to decide that for me." The leader chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at his men. "That's so?" he said, his voice filled with condescension. "Well, we're here to collect, whether you like it or not." Jed's hand moved slowly to the grip of his revolver, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. His heartbeat quickened, but his breathing remained steady. He had been in this position before, had stared down death 1,000 times. But this felt different. This time, it wasn't just survival. It was redemption. The outlaws laughed, taking a few steps closer, their eyes flicking nervously toward the woman and Tom, who stood just behind Jed. But they weren't worried about them. They were focused on Jed. "You're nothing but a ghost, Calloway," the leader sneered. "You think you can change? You think you can escape who you are?" Jed's eyes locked onto the man, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. The air was still. The ground beneath his feet felt solid, as if the earth itself was standing with him. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding behind a bar. He wasn't the man they thought he was. "No," Jed said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I'm not a ghost. I'm not running from anything. Not anymore." Before the leader could respond, Jed's revolver was in his hand, the gun rising in a blur of motion. The crack of the shot echoed across the street, sharp and clean. The leader's grin disappeared as his hand dropped to his side, blood beginning to seep through his shirt. He fell to the ground in an instant, the others frozen in disbelief. The woman didn't flinch. Neither did Tom. It was just another moment in Jed's life, another man who had underestimated him, another threat that had been removed. The remaining outlaws stood still, their faces pale, their hands hovering over their guns but not daring to draw. They knew better now. Jed had proven himself once again. And this time, it wasn't about who was faster. It was about who had the courage to face their past and the strength to stand tall. "Get out of here," Jed said, his voice cold and final. "And don't come back." The outlaws didn't hesitate. They turned and ran, disappearing into the distance, the sound of their boots fading into the wind. Jed holstered his revolver, the weight of it no longer as heavy as it had been before. He could feel the adrenaline slowly leaving his system, replaced by something quieter, something deeper. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was just peace. For the first time in years, Jed felt like he had done what he needed to do. The woman stepped up beside him, her eyes steady. "You did it," Jed nodded, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. "I had to." Tom was silent for a moment before speaking. "We all have our demons, Jed, but it's how we face them that defines us." Jed glanced back at Gold Creek, the town he had come to think of as home. He had made it through the fight, and he had faced the truth of who he was. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't a hero. But for the first time, he was at peace with himself. "You're right," Jed said, his voice quiet. "It's about how we face them." And with that, the three of them turned back toward the town. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was theirs to walk. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.